We're going to get started. Welcome to Rapture Christi. Rapture Christi, if you don't know what that means, it's Latin for reason of Christ. So we're a Christian apologetics club, which basically means that we defend the truth of Christianity with arguments and reasons. And tonight's topic is, are the Gospels historically reliable? And tonight we have a guest speaker, Dr. Jeffrey Breshears, and he's a Christian historian, apologist, and president of Areopagus, which is a Christian study center and education ministry in Atlanta, Georgia, that sponsors seminars and forums in Christian history, apologetics, science-related topics, Christian spirituality, literature, and the arts and contemporary cultural issues. Previously, he's taught history, philosophy, and religion for 18 years at Georgia State University, Kennesaw State University, and Reformed Theological Seminary. Tonight's topic is, are the Gospels historically reliable? Please welcome Dr. Jeffrey Breshears.
Thank you, Jonathan. Nice to be with you all, and very much looking forward to our session together. If you're interested, we are an Atlanta-based organization, a Christian education organization. We specialize, as Jonathan said, in apologetics, but also we do a lot with Christian history, a lot with contemporary cultural issues and science-related issues as well. In fact, a week from tonight, but of course you all have a meeting next week. Actually, next week on Wednesday and Thursday nights, we're sponsoring a forum on theistic evolution, or as theistic evolutionists prefer to call themselves these days, evolutionary creationism. And that's at 6:30 at Johnson Ferry Baptist Church. So if your Wednesday night next week is open, join us over at Johnson Ferry, 6:30 in the chapel for a forum on theistic evolution. And then the following night, we're doing the same forum out at Perimeter Church in North Fulton County, but of course you all have a meeting. If you're interested at all, I'll pass around a few of these brochures, and again, don't feel obviously obligated to take one or anything, but if it looks of interest to you, and you'd like to stay in touch or get involved in what we do, please help yourself. So, as Jonathan mentioned, I taught here actually for 5 years, and that was in the early 90s, and KSU's changed a lot, and we didn't have nice classrooms like this, and so they've certainly made a lot of progress here, to say the least, upgrading the facilities and all. So, yeah, it's nice to be with you. I understand my friend Mike was here last week, Michael Coleman, and so has anybody read his book on the resurrection? His, what is it,
Resurrection.
2,200 page book. It's what, about 750 pages. And when he sent me a copy, I remember opening it up, now it's rather thick, and I open it up, and it's just about the smallest font size I think I've ever seen. And half of the book is footnotes, and the font size is smaller, So it's a daunting book to read. Have you gotten very far into it? Have you read much into it?
Not most of it. So.
Yeah. The first third? Yeah, it's really the most exhaustive treatment, obviously, of the topic, and he's a real expert on that issue. So tonight, what I'd like to talk about, and so we want to be done by about 9, don't we? And that would include Q&A and interaction and that sort of thing. So I'm going to be relatively brief, so as to open up plenty of space for Q&A, either on the topic tonight or after I'm done. We can talk about anything for that matter. So let me just briefly introduce what we do. Areopagus, that comes from Acts 17. Of course, when Paul visited Athens, he was taken to the Areopagus, which is where the philosophers and thinkers hung around and socialized and philosophized. And in church history, that term Areopagus has oftentimes been used to symbolize the intersection of Christ and culture, Christian faith, and how it relates to our culture. So that's why we chose the name Areopagus. We As Jonathan mentioned, we specialize in, we don't do much with Bible study, although I did write a book on bibliology a year or so ago. But we do a lot of Christian history, apologetics, contemporary cultural issues, Christian spirituality, in particular the contemplative spiritual tradition, science and the Christian faith, and we do quite a bit with literature and the arts as well. And we sort of have a kind of a curriculum taxonomy. In other words, if someone were really serious about exploring the depths of apologetics and in fullness, we sort of have as I said, sort of a taxonomy that starts with basic biblical literacy, bibliology, and then of course Christian history. If you study Christian history very systematically, what you find is that along the way you encounter virtually every possible apologetics issue and theological issue, cultural, moral issue. Apologetics foundations includes some of the classical and modern arguments for the existence of God, for instance, among other things. Alternative universes looks at comparative worldviews. We compare and contrast the Christian theistic worldview with alternative worldviews. Essentially, when you boil it all down, there's really only three basic worldviews from which all other worldviews derive, and one is a theistic worldview, the other is a naturalistic or atheistic worldview, and then the third alternative is an Eastern metaphysical worldview. And so from those three basic worldviews, again, all other worldviews like existentialism, deism, even the New Age derives from those three. The theodicy issue of reconciling the problem of God and evil. And it's usually framed in this sense: if God is great, if God is omnipotent, and if God is good, why is there so much evil and suffering in the world? And this is a major impediment, it seems to me, in a lot of people coming to faith in God and faith in Jesus Christ. Perhaps they've had a very turbulent life and a very painful life, and it's hard for them to reconcile all the pain and suffering in the world with the reality of a loving and a great God. The argument being that if God truly were great, he could eliminate all pain and suffering. And if God were truly loving, he would want to eliminate all pain and suffering. But Christians believe that God is great and God is good. And yet we also recognize that this world is a cesspool of evil and corruption and pain and suffering. Oops. And then the historical quest for the real Jesus. And what I'm going to be talking about tonight is really sort of extracted from that. That's a full 18-hour course, but I won't subject you. Well, actually, most of you don't have class for about 18 hours, right? So actually, we could do the whole course. But I sense not. Okay. Special topics such as what about people who've never heard of Jesus? What's their fate? And what's the eternal destiny of non-Christians? And is there any evidence for an afterlife and heaven and hell and issues like that? That's special topics. Frontline apologetics is essentially how to share your faith in an effective and winsome way with non-believers or with other Christians that are just basically struggling with issues. So we deal with a broad range of issues in that course. And then cultural apologetics, how should we now live? And apologetics in the arts, which is one of those areas of apologetics that's often totally neglected. I've been studying apologetics for most of my life, and there's frankly very little written on a Christian assessment of the arts, and it's a great field of study. This is kind of our basic publication, The Problem of Christian Anti-Intellectualism, why Christians should study apologetics. Yeah, okay, so that's really all I wanted to show. So how do I eliminate, how do I erase the evidence here for the problem? No. Oh, I don't know. Yeah, that's fine. So I suppose everybody has a copy of the outline, the 4-page outline. So we'll just go through that. And I'm going to actually go through it, I think, rather rapidly again. It's a lot of material, and we don't have that much time. Now, I know that some people who come and speak would like for you to hold your questions till they're finished. And but I much prefer the other option, and that is, if any particular relevant questions or issues come up, please feel free to interject, and don't feel like you'll be interrupting anything. And so I think that's a whole lot more comfortable and spontaneous when we just sort of process things as we go along. So again, don't feel like you're interrupting the process. So what I'd like to do is really just deal with a couple of issues related to, are the Gospels historically reliable? And one is, I'd like to present what I consider to be the skeptic's best argument for why not to believe in the historical integrity and reliability of the Gospels. And then I'd like to address the skeptic's argument by looking at the case for the Gospels. And of course, this can't be in any way a comprehensive treatment, but hopefully it'll help frame the issue and be advantageous and efficacious for you in that respect. Now, according to liberal theologians and skeptics, we can really know very little about the historical Jesus. Are any of you familiar with the organization called the Jesus Seminar?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay. What's your understanding? What is, or actually what was, the Jesus Seminar?
Basically a bunch of really fringe scholars who, like people like Marcus Borg or John Dominic Crossan, who basically have all these really unorthodox sort of ideas about the historicity of the New Testament and Jesus and all that stuff.
Yeah, looking at the continuum of biblical scholarship, the Jesus Seminar sort of was the extreme left wing of very radical deconstructionists. And the reason we mention them from time to time, they're not very relevant anymore, but back in the 1990s, they got a tremendous amount of media exposure, and they had far more influence than they were ever due. But as I said, they represent just a small radical fraction of the mainstream biblical scholars. In fact, they're much more radical than most liberal biblical scholars. But in their publication, The Five Gospels, which was essentially edited by a man named Robert Funk, the Jesus Seminar makes this comment: the Jesus of the Gospels is an imaginative theological construct into which has been woven traces of that enigmatic sage of Nazareth, traces that cry out for recognition and liberation from the firm grip of those whose faith empowered their memories. The search for the authentic Jesus is a search for the forgotten Jesus. Now, this is a view that a lot of skeptics hold, and you're probably familiar, if you know what the Jesus Seminar is, then undoubtedly you're familiar with scholars like Bart Ehrman, who's the chair of the religion department at the University of North Carolina, and he's another very liberal biblical scholar. And Bart Ehrman tells us that the New Testament accounts are not historically reliable. They're not reliable descriptions of what really happened when Jesus was born and how he lived his life. But he'll go on to tell us that it doesn't really matter whether the New Testament accounts of Jesus' life are historically reliable, because what really matters is not the historical Jesus, but what he calls the Christ of faith. In other words, what Jesus symbolizes. And Ehrman puts it this way: the New Testament is useful, he says, for theological reflection on the meaning and the importance of Jesus. But that doesn't mean that there necessarily ever was a historical Jesus, or if there was a historical Jesus, it doesn't mean that we know anything about him. Now, by the way, just an aside, Bart Ehrman, of course, does believe, as do probably 95+% of biblical scholars, including very liberal scholars, he does believe there was a historical Jesus. And in fact, if you ever run across somebody who questions or challenges the reality of the historical Jesus, One book I would recommend that they read is Bart Ehrman's critique of this very extreme radical group who denies the reality of the historical Jesus. He just thoroughly destroys their arguments. So you can actually use a skeptic like Bart Ehrman, a very liberal scholar, to defeat an even more radical extreme view, such as was there in fact a historical Jesus? But he doesn't believe that we can know much about Jesus through the New Testament gospel accounts. But the problem here is that once we separate the Jesus of history from the Christ of faith, we basically create a new faith based on an imaginary and mythical Christ. And the Christ of faith essentially becomes a very free-floating construct of our own imagination. The scholar Grant Jeffrey puts it this way: it does very much matter whether or not Jesus of Nazareth truly lived and died and rose from the dead. If the Gospel's record about Jesus is nothing more than a curious myth, then Christianity is a fraudulent religion that has deceived billions of people over the last 2,000 years. He goes on to say, if Jesus did not rise triumphantly from the tomb, then our hope of salvation is nothing more than a dream based on the greatest lie in all of human history. The position espoused by many modern religious philosophers is that the idea or the myth of Jesus is the truly important thing, but ultimately, if Christianity is divorced from historical events, as described in the Gospels, for instance, then everyone is free to create their own Christ in their own image. But a mythological Jesus, he says, cannot reconcile humanity to God. The mystery of Jesus is that he's both part of history and also he transcends history. Some of you are familiar with the Christian philosopher William Lane Craig, and Bill puts it this way: if the historical Jesus is not identical to the Christ of faith, then to continue to worship and pray to the Christ of faith is either idolatry, in other words, it would be tantamount to worshiping and praying to a dead man, or else it's self-delusion, worshiping and praying to a figment of one's own imagination. So the bifurcation that liberals and skeptical scholars try to create between the historical Jesus and the so-called Christ of faith, by the way, their argument being that the Christ of faith is really just a construct of the early church, and it has little, if anything, to do with the real historical Jesus. It's the early church that transformed this good man, this rabbi, this great gifted teacher, and they took this man and tried to deify him and pass him off as the Son of God and the Savior of humanity and so on. So that's what we're referring to when we talk about the Christ of faith versus the Jesus of history. And that's one of the favorite arguments by skeptics. Gregory Boyd puts it this way: Jesus is really not a symbol for anything unless he's rooted in history. He goes on to say, theological truth is based on historical truth. I don't want to base my life on a symbol. I want reality. And by the way, even liberal and neo-Orthodox scholars, some of them, like Reinhold Niebuhr, for instance, understood that the nature of Jesus is the critical issue. Niebuhr put it this way: there's one thing that somebody must believe in order to be a Christian, and that is that Jesus was more than just a common, ordinary man. So again, even someone like Reinhold Niebuhr understands that this is the basis for the faith, and it needs to be taken seriously. So when it comes to skeptical scholarship, I'd like to talk about some of their fundamental presuppositions that underlie their skepticism, and then we'll sort of come back and address those. But let me just pause briefly. Any comments or questions before we move on? This gives me a water break. Who is who's it? Marco Rubio? I had a drinking problem. Watched Marco Rubio always has this bottle of water.
I'd like to make one comment. I thought when you said about Bart Ehrman, I thought it was very interesting that many of the Muslim apologists against Christianity used him until Bart came out with a book that said no, Jesus was real, and a lot of this stuff can't, you know, if it went too far to prove Christianity for the Muslims so they could drop him as one of their sources.
Yeah.
That was interesting.
Yeah, there's a church where I teach a lot, and there's a fella that for years kind of skulked around, and he'd drift into a class occasionally, and he'd raise some skeptical questions, and then he'd sort of disappear and dematerialize, then you'd see him maybe a month or two later and all. And so one time after a session, he was telling me that there never actually was a historical Jesus. It's all just a myth and a legend. And so it gave me a good opportunity. I said, well, do you like Bart Ehrman? Oh, yeah, I read all his books. And I said, well, you ought to read his book on Did Jesus Exist? Because it totally destroys the Jesus myth concept. All right.
That was the name of the book, Did Jesus Exist?
I think
Is that
that's the name of the book, yes, if I remember correctly. Yeah.
And what's so great about Bart Ehrman is that he's an agnostic bordering atheism. So he's not a friend to Christianity.
Oh, not at all. In fact, he teaches some of the most popular courses in religion at UNC. And I don't know if he still does this. I'd like to go up there and sit in on his first session sometime, just an interloper in the class. But used to, Bart Ehrman, and he would have like 400 or 500 people in his class, and he would start out his course asking, is anybody in here a Christian who, believes in the Bible and so on? And he'd always get, at least a few hands raised. And Ehrman would tell the class that by the time this course is over, you'll doubt everything that you ever believed when you came into this course. So he sees himself as an evangelist. He's an evangelist for skepticism. And apparently he's very effective at what he does because so many students go off to college without any apologetics background. And so they can't really defend what they purport to believe. So they're basically pretty easy prey for somebody like him. Well, let's take a look here at skeptical scholarship, and again, we'll sort of run through this rather briefly and rapidly. Now, what's the underlying presupposition of the skeptics? Well, it's essentially an anti-supernatural bias. And they're operating on the basis of naturalistic presuppositions, and they have an a priori bias against miracles or, for instance, predictive prophecy. Obviously, if there's no such thing as divine revelation, if there's no such thing as miracles, then predictive prophecy, you couldn't possibly believe in that. And so they reject the incarnation, they reject the virgin birth and the resurrection of Jesus, and they reject miracles in general. And it's not because they have good reasons to do so, it's because they're prejudiced. They have an anti-supernatural bias. So the question would be, on what basis do they have this naturalistic, atheistic bias, and are there any good reasons? See, it's not just Christians who have the responsibility to defend what we believe. Everybody who purports to believe anything has a responsibility to be able to defend what they believe. So oftentimes we think that we bear the total onus of responsibility for defending the faith, but anybody who doesn't believe in Christianity should be able to generate good reasons why they don't believe. But typically they're clueless. They cannot do that. Now, according to the second point then, as you see there in your notes, is that, of course, they'll claim that the New Testament's historically unreliable and that they were really just sort of manufactured by the early church. According to Robert Funk, again, remember him, he was involved in the infamous Jesus Seminar. According to Robert Funk, the goal of the Jesus Seminar was to liberate Jesus from the Gospels. He goes on to say, we need a new narrative of Jesus, we need a new gospel. And he goes on to talk about how the Gospels needed to be purged of what he calls later accretions or other distortions of faith. And of course, the people in the Jesus Seminar believed that only sophisticated scholars like themselves were capable of making that distinction. Now, based on that presupposition, Jesus Seminar scholars assume that the New Testament texts are illegitimate unless they can prove themselves otherwise. Now, think about that. That is a standard of proof that we don't impose on any other historical documents or any ancient history or anything like that. In other words, we assume, and this has always been the case in historical studies, we always assume that the text is generally true and reliable unless it betrays itself as not being true and reliable. See, otherwise, you couldn't know anything about history. You couldn't know anything about the past. So unless there's good reason to doubt what is written, and sometimes there is, but unless there is good reason to doubt, you assume that the text is more or less true in what it espouses. But when it comes to the Bible, see, they apply this unreasonably, impossibly high standard that they don't apply to any other ancient text. And they're adamant that they will not believe unless the Bible can prove that it's true. And again, that's a standard that no ancient text can ascribe to. So it's really unreasonable. And it's rather intellectually dishonest, frankly. As Gregory Boyd puts it, historians usually operate with the burden of proof on the historian to prove falsity or unreliability, since people are generally not compulsive liars. Without that assumption, we wouldn't know anything about ancient history. He goes on to say the Jesus Seminar turns all of this on its head and says that you've got to affirmatively prove that the saying came from Jesus, or that Jesus actually did something that's recorded in the Gospels. And of course, again, that's just unreasonable and unprovable. But according to the Jesus Seminar, the Gospels were not written by the real or historical Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but they were later creations in the 2nd century by churches, and these Gospels were written, quote, in the spirit of Matthew, the historical Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. According to Robert Funk, very little of the Gospels is authentic. In fact, he goes so far as to say that less than 25% of the words attributed to Jesus were actually his. Less than 25%.
And how do you prove that?
Yeah.
Is it the redder letters?
What's that? It's the
in the Bible, there's red letters, and the really, really red letters are only 25%.
Yes. Well, you'd have to ask Mr. Funk, because I couldn't possibly make the case. But see, this is based on a very arrogant presupposition that they hold, and that is that they are these super intellects who can actually discern what Jesus really said and did as opposed to what's just attributed to Jesus. But again, that's just breathtakingly arrogant, to assume that you can do that. So less than 25% of the words that are recorded in the Gospels that Jesus spoke are actually authentic. And according to Robert Funk in the Jesus Seminar, almost the entire Gospel of John is fraudulent. There's only a few lines in the entire book that they consider to be authentic. For instance, when it comes to the Lord's Prayer, they've assessed the Lord's Prayer, and they've concluded that the only thing that we know for certain that Jesus prayed was Our Father, which made for a very short prayer. Our Father, okay, let's go eat. So again, I hope you see just how preposterously arrogant, this mentality is. And they actually published a book called The Five Gospels, and it was Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then the fifth gospel would have been what? Any ideas?
Q or M?
Well, that would be a good assumption. No, the Gospel of Thomas, a 2nd century word. And in the four Gospels, the canonical Gospels, they color-coded every word. If I remember correctly, red meant that, Jesus really did say that or did that. Pink was, well, it's rather questionable. Gray was probably not. Black was absolutely not, you know. And so you leaf through that book, and it's mostly gray and black, you know, when you're reading through the Gospels. Furthermore, they'll argue the book of Acts, the Acts of the Apostles, and the Pauline epistles are not reputable sources when it comes to the historical Jesus either. And they believe that Paul distorted the life and the teachings of Jesus. And basically, and you've probably heard this theory before, that Paul, quote, invented Christianity. And that Pauline Christianity has little, if anything, to do with what Jesus actually taught and did. Okay, so again, this is the so-called Christ of faith theory. Yes?
What do you think they meant by saying like the 5 Gospels? Because wasn't the Gospel of Thomas just like a bunch of like cryptic statements that it was saying Jesus had said?
Well, what's interesting, or I guess I should say what we should expect from these people is, you know, they're hypercritical of the canonical Gospels. But on the other hand, they give these extra biblical writings a total pass. They apply a totally different standard. So while being hypercritical of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they hold this Gospel of Thomas in very high esteem. Even though nobody, including radical scholars, nobody thinks that the historical Thomas had anything to do with that book. And it's always dated to probably the mid-2nd century, if not the late 2nd century. And yet, despite that, they want to, because it presents an alternative view of Jesus, kind of a Gnostic understanding of Jesus, they hold the Gospel of Thomas in very high esteem, as they do the other so-called Gnostic Gospels. So again, it's just an unreasonable double standard that they apply. All right, so let's move on here. Thirdly, they will argue that the testimonies of the early church fathers are, of course, unreliable. And why is it that we should not take seriously the commentaries of the early church fathers when it comes to the historical Jesus? Well, it's because they say the church fathers were biased in favor of Christianity. And they were biased in favor of the Christ myth. So that they were actually the main perpetrators of the Jesus myth. So you can't take seriously anything that you read in the church fathers either. Now, fourthly, is the point that the non-canonical Gospels, again, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Judas, these kind of works, shed as much light on early Christianity as do the books of the New Testament. So, and what they'll do, and this started with a scholar at Princeton by the name of Elaine Pagels back in the late 70s, early 80s. What they'll try to do is argue that the so-called Gnostic Gospels that were written in the 2nd and 3rd centuries are just as valid and authentic and legitimate as are the 1st century Gospels that are included, you know, in our New Testament. And again, it's a curious argument because it's just not only counterintuitive, but there's no reason to take it seriously whatsoever. So as I said, they're hypercritical of the canonical Gospels, but when it comes to the non-canonical Gospels written in later centuries, they are amazingly uncritical, and they impute all of this authority and authenticity to these works that, again, no serious scholar ever thinks were written by the apostles or the associates of the apostles. So talk about bias, you know, and in this case, a very unreasonable bias. They certainly expose themselves in that respect. Now, fifthly, they'll argue that for more than 1900 years, the church has misunderstood and misapplied what the gospel is all about. Traditional Christianity, they will argue, distorted the message of the real Jesus. Now, by the way, do you sense any inherent contradiction in what they're arguing here? See, they're saying that we can't know anything much about the historical Jesus from the Gospels or the New Testament, and yet they're going to argue that historic Christianity has distorted the real Jesus. How would they know? Because according to them, there's no reliable sources for the historical Jesus. So it's an inherent contradiction, but we shouldn't be surprised, if skeptics like that contradict themselves and if a lot of their pronouncements are illogical. So anyway, they'll argue that traditional Christianity has distorted the message of the real Jesus, just as the Gospels provide a distorted mythical narrative of the life of Jesus. And instead of Jesus being the divine Savior of humanity, the Son of God, and so on, they will argue that Jesus was really just a very gifted rabbi, and that his mission in life was to propagate a radical social gospel and a critique of the established order. John Dominic Crossan, I think somebody mentioned Crossan in relation to the Jesus Seminar. John Dominic Crossan refers to Jesus as a Jewish cynic. If you're familiar with philosophy, ancient philosophy, who the cynics were. So he says that Jesus was a Jewish cynic, a social rebel, and of course had nothing to do with being divine or the savior of humanity or anything like that. Then they'll go on and make another rather preposterous statement, and that is that we can actually know something about the Jesus of history in the early church, but we can't know anything based on the New Testament. In other words, their argument here is that if we can know anything at all about the real Jesus, it has to be outside the New Testament, outside the Bible. And they'll argue that instead we should rely upon the latest findings or the latest theories in the social sciences when it comes to historical criticism, literary textual criticism, anthropology, sociology, psychology, and so on. So they would argue that those should be our guides when it comes to discerning, who and what Jesus really was. And of course, it's on assumptions like that John Dominic Crossan will make declarations such as that Jesus died on the cross, but he was never buried. His body was taken down from the cross, and the body was thrown into a common grave, and his body was devoured by wild dogs. That's what happened to the body. That's why nobody could find the body. 3 days later, or whatever, the dogs had eaten it, out of the city dung. And now, is there any historical basis for believing that? And of course, there's absolutely none whatsoever. It's just his conjecture based on his own bias.
Is he the only scholar who believes that?
Oh, no. But he's certainly been one of those who's popularized that theory. Now, again, even most liberal scholars would say that's just absurd. But there are others than just Crossan.
You know what amazes me by hearing you talk?
Mm-hmm.
You sound exactly like Muslim apologists. I mean, they use...
Thank you.
No, I'm saying the things that you're going through. It is amazing. This is the...
Yes.
They use this
You're absolutely right.
so much.
See, Muslim apologists have generated relatively few original arguments against Christianity. They've borrowed all their arguments derivatively from so-called Christian, liberal Christian scholars or secular Western scholars. So you're absolutely right. And they seize on stuff like this. Well, let's see. The principle of double dissimilarity, let's see, I think for time's sake, that's really predicated again on another questionable tenet, and that is that we should only believe that Jesus said or did something if there's no other parallels to it in other ancient sources. Now, if that sounds just ridiculously opaque, it should, because, see, their point here is that if Jesus said anything or did anything that sounds like either the Jewish rabbinical tradition or the traditions of the early church, then we naturally assume that what he did or said has been imputed to him. And see, this is totally irrational because it requires everything that Jesus said or did to be totally original. But of course, he was living in a particular culture. Darrell Bock puts it this way. He says, the fact is that great figures in history do interact with and reflect their culture, even if they do it in creative ways. Gregory Boyd sort of attacks this idea by saying the obvious problem with this principle of double dissimilarity is that Jesus was in fact Jewish, and he did in fact found the Christian church. So we shouldn't be surprised if Jesus sounds Jewish and Christian. But again, it's one of these just absurdly irrational arguments that they'll put forth in their attempt to deconstruct the integrity of the scriptures. And then lastly, or eighthly rather, the principle of multiple attestation. Well, that says that we shouldn't believe anything written about Jesus unless there's multiple sources for it. But then when it comes to the three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we know that they share some similarities. Matthew and Luke probably borrowed some of their material from Mark, and there's also good reason to believe that two or three of the Gospels also borrowed some common material from another source, the so-called Q source. And yet they'll argue that doesn't meet the criterion for multiple attestation because they're too similar. So on the one hand, they're telling us we can't believe anything unless there's multiple sources, but we have multiple sources that they won't accept because they're a little too similar. And then when it comes to the Gospel of John, believe it or not, their critique of the Gospel of John is that it's too dissimilar from the other three Gospels. So, if it sounds like they're just making it up as they go along, I think you'd be on the right track.
Isn't it also the problem with them demanding that there would be multiple sources? The problem of how unrealistic that is because of how little of what happened back then was written down and how little of that even survives to this day.
That's right. A lot of what we, quote, know about ancient history oftentimes comes from a single source. And again, if the source seems credible, if there's no good reason to doubt it, then you generally accept it. Now, when Caesar wrote his commentaries on the Gallic War, we know Caesar's a politician and Caesar lies. Okay, but that doesn't mean that everything he wrote, is incorrect. In fact, we generally think that he wrote rather accurately about most of his adventures. Yes?
When it says nearly the whole Gospel of John is fraudulent, was John related to Jesus, family-wise?
There is a tradition that holds that they probably were. They might have been cousins.
Yeah, that's what I heard in CCD class when I was younger.
Yeah, in what?
CCD class,
Which is
just church class, basically.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's some reason to believe that.
Yeah. I was just wondering.
Yeah, when it comes to these traditions associated with Jesus that are extra-biblical traditions, the earlier the tradition is, the more reason there is to take it fairly seriously.
Right.
Now, if it's a tradition that all of a sudden came up in the 4th or 5th or 6th or 7th centuries, we tend not to give traditions like that much credit.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. All right. So any other comments before we go on? We've got to deconstruct everything I've said up to this point in 10 minutes. Anything? Okay. All right. So let's try to do that or at least make as much progress as we can. So, what is the case for the Gospels? And Matthew, I know you need to cut away. You've got an appointment. So thanks for coming.
Thank you.
And don't feel like you're interrupted.
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. Now, the significance of the Gospels. It's really important, I think, to understand that the four Gospels are not just our best primary sources of information when it comes to the life and teachings of Jesus. They are literally our only primary sources. So again, if we're going to apply typical historical standards, we would give them the benefit of the doubt. We would assume they're telling the truth unless they betray themselves as being, inaccurate. And by the way, with all the little minutia details in these 4 Gospels, when it comes to geography and other issues that we can verify archaeologically and in terms of extra biblical sources, it's interesting to note that there's really no reason to question anything that's in the Gospels as being, as having been proven false. Now, when it comes to the literary genre of the Gospels, modern skeptical scholars, of course, dismiss the Gospels as being mostly fictitious. The infamous liberal Rudolf Bultmann, back in the 1940s and 50s, considered the Gospels to be, quote, cult legends, in which traces of the historical Jesus occasionally could be found. Some scholars regard the Gospels as ancient biographies, but they certainly are not biographies in the modern sense. Now, last week, I understand you had Mike here, Mike Lacona. Did this issue come up of ancient biographies? Did he talk about that? Okay, all right. And I probably would not totally agree with him, but he does put forth some interesting arguments. Now, like I said, whether they're ancient biographies or not, they certainly don't comport with modern biography, because no modern biography would write about somebody's life story and leave out virtually their entire childhood and their formative years. And yet that's what we find in the 4 Gospels, other than a very brief couple of birth narratives, and then there's this, very brief story about Jesus going off to Jerusalem when he's 12 years old with his parents. Other than that, we don't know anything about his first 30 years, his formative years. And so a modern biographer would never write like that, of course. Also, no modern biographer would write a life story without providing a careful chronology of what happened. But we have to, again, keep in mind that the mentality in ancient times is different than it is today. See, we want absolute chronological specificity down to the most minute things. So if somebody was writing, for instance, a biography of John F. Kennedy, and they write in their biography, John F. Kennedy was elected president of the United States in 1962, and so go on, so on, so on. Well, you think, well, wait a minute, that's not true. He was elected president in 1960, not 1962. This guy's an idiot. This guy doesn't know anything, see? So that's sort of how we would think today. But that's more modern thinking. Ancient biographers basically are interested not with minutia and chronological minutia, but what is the meaning and the purpose and of this person's life. That's what they really want to focus in on. So if not biographies, at least in the modern sense, what are the Gospels? And I think the best explanation probably is one that comes from Bruce Metzger, the great biblical scholar from Princeton, who wrote that what each evangelist preserved is not a photographic reproduction of the words and deeds of Jesus, but an interpretive portrait delineated in accord with the special needs of the early church. So these are interpretive portraits, and they're written to specific audiences to try and emphasize certain aspects of Jesus' life and teachings for a particular purpose. And that's where we get these slight variations, in the various Gospels. One of the early church fathers, a great philosopher in the 2nd century who lived in Rome, we know him as Justin Martyr, he called the Gospels simply the memoirs of the apostles. Okay. F.F. Bruce, a great modern scholar, puts it this way: our Gospels are not biographies, for the primitive Christian message was not concerned with the biographical interest of Jesus' life, but with certain outstanding events through which the salvation of God was made available to men and women. So I think he's pretty much right on there. Now, as far as the primary purpose of the Gospels, again, it's not to write a detailed biography of Jesus' life, but it's rather to emphasize the purpose and the meaning of Jesus' life and ministry. Because when you think about it, when all is said and done, that's really what matters, okay, is the meaning and purpose. Who wrote the Gospels? Well, you probably know that they're all written anonymously. And, none of them says this is the gospel, as written by Matthew, the disciple, or anything like that. So the question always comes up, why were the gospels written anonymously? And we really don't know, because typically when people wrote biographies in ancient times, just like a biographer today, they wanted to take credit for what they had written. I think it's reasonable to assume that these four gospel writers probably considered themselves unworthy to attach their names to an account of somebody who they believed was the divine Son of God. And so perhaps in all humility, they don't attach their name to it. Plus, what they're writing is not an original work when you think about it. This is the Jesus story that they've experienced and that the Christian community celebrates. And the Christian community is keeping this oral tradition of Jesus. And so really all they're doing is committing to paper what was standard, the standard Jesus story in the early church. Now, there's a tradition that comes from the early 2nd century via an author by the name of Papias. And it was Papias who actually assigned authorship to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And according to Papias, he gets his information from the four daughters of Philip the Evangelist. If you're familiar with the book of Acts, you remember Philip the Evangelist, Philip, not the disciple, and his four daughters who were prophetesses. And according to Papias, he got his information on authorship and such from these daughters of Philip. Now, a generation after Papias, in other words, by the time we get to about the 170s, a little beyond the mid-2nd century, the church father Irenaeus confirms the traditional authorship. And by the way, there were absolutely no alternative theories. Nobody ever challenged the traditional authorship. Christians didn't, and non-Christians never challenged the traditionally received authorship. And it's rather inconceivable that every church and every Christian group would have agreed on the authorship of these books if their identity had in any way been in question. So apparently there is a total consensus on who wrote these various Gospels. Timothy Paul Jones puts it this way: the authors connected with the New Testament Gospels consistently remain the same from one manuscript to another. Why is this the case? Because when the churches received these written Gospels, they also received more than just these texts, more than just these documents. They also received stories, oral histories from the 1st century about the origins of these Gospels. So they don't just get a book, they also get passed along to them the oral tradition of this is the account of Jesus' life written by John, the beloved disciple, and so on. So that's part of the tradition, and it's never challenged. And you know that if it was questionable at all, then it would have been challenged both by Christians and by non-Christians as well. So all four of the gospel writers are either eyewitnesses to the life and ministry of Jesus, or else they are close associates of eyewitnesses. So in the case of Matthew, or many believe that his alternative name was Levi, he's one of the 12 disciples of Jesus. So he would have known Jesus intimately and more or less lived with Jesus for about 3 years and observed his ministry. In the case of Mark, or John Mark, he's an associate both of the Apostle Peter and also the Apostle Paul. And he writes his gospel, according to the tradition, based on Peter's recollections of Jesus' life. So there actually is a gospel of Peter. But the gospel of Peter is the gospel of Mark. Luke is, as you know, an associate of Paul. He's a medical doctor. He's a very conscientious scholar and historian. And he tells us in the prologue to his gospel that he did extensive eyewitness interviews in order to write as accurate an account of Jesus' life as absolutely possible. And then, of course, when it comes to John, most believe that he was the disciple John, later the Apostle John. Others say, well, actually, there was another leader in the early church in the city of Ephesus called John the Elder, and he's the one who might have written the gospel. But John the Elder and the Apostle John might very well have been the same person, okay? And maybe when, the older he got, he was given this other title or something like that. But anyway, he would have known Jesus intimately, and of course he was part of Jesus' inner core of disciples. Now, were the traditional authors capable even of writing the Gospels? Well, if Matthew is a tax collector, and if Luke was in fact a physician, in all likelihood they were literate. So yes, they would have been able to read and write. Now, in the case of Mark and John, well, maybe they were able to read and write. There's some indication, you raised the issue a while ago about John maybe being a relative of Jesus. And there's some indication that John and his family had connections with socially prominent people in Jerusalem. And if that were the case, then almost certainly he would have been literate himself. But let's just say that neither Mark nor John were literate. It wouldn't matter, because what they're doing is relating the story of Jesus to scribes who will write it down, for them. So whether they were literate or not is really irrelevant. And by the way, the ability to read and write was actually fairly common in first century Israel among Jewish males. Because if you were a devout Jew, you were expected to be able to read from the Torah, from the Old Testament scriptures in the synagogue, and comment on the Torah. So there's good reason to believe, and Josephus and Philo of Alexandria both imply, that literacy in first century Israel was not rare. It was fairly common. Now, that doesn't mean that half the people were literate, but apparently a healthy percent were, because again, if you took your religion seriously, you needed to be able to read and write and comment on the ancient scriptures. The question that sometimes arises, okay, in Acts chapter 4, Peter and John are dragged before the Sanhedrin and warned not to keep preaching about Jesus. And the people in the Sanhedrin say, you're just insignificant, uneducated people anyway. You don't have any right to be speaking publicly anyway. And so they call Peter and John, quote, uneducated. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they were illiterate. It may very well just simply mean that they were uneducated in terms of being professional Jewish scribes, such as the members of the Sanhedrin would have been. Let's see. When is the bell going to ring? What's that?
9:15.
Okay, all right. Let me kind of prioritize this so that we can... let's look, if you don't mind, at page 4, the bias issue. Okay, here's the question. The 4 Gospels are all written by biased people. All these people believe in Jesus. And so, can we really trust what they wrote? All right, now, if you've thought much about any kind of scholarship and writing, and we're talking here specifically about historical writing and scholarship, you know that there is no such thing as an unbiased scholar. There's no such thing as an unbiased historian. All historians bring their biases and their presuppositions and their agenda with them when they write. So the issue is never, is this person prejudiced? Is this person biased? That's never the issue. The issue is always, does his bias correlate to truth and reality? Now, writers with very strong, passionate biases oftentimes can be very strongly committed to the truth and in preserving the truth of a historical event. For instance, after World War II, most of the early histories of the Holocaust were written by Jewish scholars. Now, we wouldn't say, and these Jewish scholars, of course, all despise the Nazis, but we wouldn't disqualify a Jewish scholar from writing about the Holocaust just because they hate Nazis. That doesn't mean they're totally incapable of writing the truth about what happened. And so this issue of the Gospels being written by pro-Jesus advocates, it's a total red herring. It doesn't in any way imply that they're incapable of writing the truth about the life of Jesus. Then a rather important issue when it comes to verifying the historicity of the Gospels and why should we take the Gospels seriously as historical documents would have a lot to do with the dating of the Gospels. And it would only make sense that the shorter the gap between an actual event and when the event is written, then the more reason there would naturally be to take what was written seriously, because again, the gap's not that wide. As time goes on, memories begin to fade, and as time goes on, people tend to think more simplistically about people and things of the past. In other words, the rich complexity and ambiguities begin to fade over time, and people either tend to sort of romanticize people and things of the past, or else they tend to demonize people and things in the past, the longer the gap is. So liberal scholars, of course, will typically date the Gospels as late in the first century as possible. In fact, if you go back 60 or 80 years ago and back into the 19th century, there were skeptical scholars who were claiming that the Gospels were written in the 2nd century. Hardly anybody, even most radical scholars, don't even claim that anymore. But they'll try to create as wide a gap as possible between Jesus, who we believe was crucified and resurrected either in the year 30 or 33. They'll try to create as large a gap as possible before the first gospel accounts of his life appear. So the standard scholarly dating for the Gospels is that Mark wrote his account in the 70s, and most all scholars believe that Mark was the first one to write, and that Matthew and Luke probably wrote in the 80s, and John wrote in the mid to late 90s. Again, I think there's a hidden agenda to these dates, because, see, liberal scholars are adamant that the Gospels could not have been written before the year 70. And why would that be?
The destruction of the temple.
Yeah. And lots of other significant things in Christian history happened before the year 70 as well. But in particular, Jesus prophesies the destruction of the temple and implies that it's going to come within about a generation of his time. And so if you don't believe in predictive prophecy, if you don't believe in miracles, then of course you can't possibly believe that Jesus actually predicted or prophesied the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. So that being the case, the temple was destroyed in the year 70, so we're going to have to post-date the Gospels to after 70, and then we're going to make up the story that Jesus predicted that the temple would be destroyed. So I think very clearly that's a driving motivation on their part. Now, when it comes to dating the Gospels, I think a strong case can be made that the real key to this is, when was the book of Acts written? Because, Acts is a sequel to Luke's Gospel. So you probably recall from your reading of the Acts of the Apostle that at the end of the book, after recounting in great detail Paul's trial in Jerusalem and his voyage to Rome, Luke rather abruptly ends the story. And he leaves Paul under house arrest in Rome, awaiting his audience with Caesar. The Caesar at the time was Nero. And again, after all this rich detail, say all of a sudden the story just chops off. Okay? And so curiously, Luke does not go on to mention very, very important things that happened after that. For instance, Paul is put on trial, and apparently his case is dismissed, because Clement of Rome at the end of the 1st century tells us that Paul actually left Rome after his trial, and he traveled to the, quote, farthest bounds of the West. Now, the farthest bounds of the West would be Spain, right? Hispania, okay? and that he later returned to Rome, and when he returned to Rome, he was rearrested, and that time he was executed. Okay? So Luke doesn't talk about the subsequent travels of Paul or his execution. Likewise, he doesn't talk about the execution of Peter, which occurred in the mid-60s as well. He also doesn't talk about the death of the leader of the Jerusalem church, James the Just, the half-brother of Jesus. Now, James, by all accounts, was martyred in the year 62 or maybe 63. And Luke doesn't mention that, and that's very significant because, as I said, James the Just was really, along with probably Peter, was considered one of the top leaders in the Christian movement at the time. Furthermore, he doesn't mention the Neronian persecutions of the Christians, which are just heinous and affected, we don't know how many, undoubtedly hundreds, if not thousands of Christians were butchered under Nero. Very significant event, and yet Luke doesn't talk about it at all. Furthermore, he doesn't mention the Zealot revolt going on back in Israel that led to the destruction of the city of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. So, therefore, based on that, many scholars deduce that Luke probably wrote his Acts of the Apostles in the year 62, while Paul is still awaiting his trial before Nero. And by the way, there's even been liberal scholars like Adolf von Harnack, for instance, certainly no conservative, who originally dated the Acts of the Apostles much later in the first century, but after careful study, von Harnack revised his dating and wrote that Luke probably wrote the book of Acts in the year 62. So why this is all important is because, as we said, Acts is the sequel to the Gospel of Luke. So if he writes Acts in the year 62, he wrote his Gospel of Luke at least, a year or two or three or four prior to that. And most all scholars, conservative and liberal, believe that the Gospel of Matthew probably preceded the Gospel of Luke. And furthermore, virtually all scholars believe that the Gospel of Mark was the first one written, and then Matthew, and then Luke. So if you sort of backtrack there, it's reasonable to assume that the Gospel of Mark was probably written maybe in the mid-50s or possibly even earlier than the mid-50s, which means that it could have been written only about 20 years after the time of Christ, which is well within, the range of very, very accurate memory recollection. So the reason this is important is because it does narrow the gap tremendously between the life of Jesus and the accounts of Jesus that are written later. And again, that would be another good reason to suppose that the gospel accounts are historically reliable and can be taken seriously. So you see there on page 4 the summa of it all. And when all is said and done, frankly, there just are no good reasons to doubt the historicity or the general reliability of the Gospels. The only basis on which to dismiss them as legendary would be an overtly anti-supernatural prejudice. But all the evidence seems to argue otherwise. And by the way, we haven't even mentioned all the archaeological evidence that supports the gospel accounts as well. So again, the bottom line, frankly, there's no good reasons to doubt the historicity of the Gospels. And, like a lot of these areas in apologetics, we could go much, much, much deeper. And, kind of the deeper you go, the more, I think, the more interesting all this becomes. But I hope that's been at least an adequate introduction to the topic. Do we have time for questions, comments, disputations?
Oh, go ahead, Steve.
No, I just think it's interesting that it seems like a lot of the people that are here arguing against the New Testament and the Jesus seminar people in the 1990s, that it's almost like that they missed all this history and went back to the 1920s or something, as if as if that were the way you approach the Gospels instead of more recently. I mean, I forget when Sir William Ramsay lived, but he was one of the most prominent archaeologists of all time, and he was trained in this kind of old school. The Gospels were written in the 100s AD. And but then, as he actually began to travel and do hands-on investigations, it became so evident that the Gospels and Acts were historically reliable that he that he began to use the Bible as a source to find the cities and places that he was looking for. So a complete turnaround, which he wrote about extensively. But it's almost like the Jesus Seminar people. And
just totally discount.
Just kind of act like we're still living in the 1920s or something. When the old German higher criticism was.
I suppose they think he was getting senile by the time he turned 40. the only time you can take people seriously is earlier in their career. He's really an interesting character. This guy was perhaps the preeminent archaeologist of his era, and he was a professor of archaeology at both Oxford and Cambridge. And as you mentioned, now by the way, he was educated at Tübingen University. Does that have any significance, Tübingen in Germany?
Hotbed of liberal scholarship.
That was where radical biblical scholarship actually began, was at Tübingen. So it is the paradigm of radical scholarship, and that's where Ramsay was actually educated. And so, as you say, he started out doubting the historicity of the Gospels and the New Testament in general, and later wrote that Luke is a historian of the first rank and should be placed along with the greatest of all historians. So, yeah, good point you raised. Other issues?
When Bart Ehrman says that the gospel writers all were Aramaic speaking low class citizens, basically, how do you argue that they at least knew Greek at the time?
It wasn't unusual for Jews in the first century to be multilingual. And again, see, whether they were literate or not, they oftentimes could converse, at least on an elementary level, in Greek, which was the international language. And then, of course, Aramaic was their common everyday language. Now, if they were serious Jews, religious Jews, they also knew Hebrew. Now, you also needed to know at least a little Latin, because that was the official language of the Roman Empire. So there's every reason to believe that they would have been, if not fluent in all these languages, at least familiar with them. That sparked my thoughts here. I thought I had a footnote here related to that particular issue. I'll kind of look here and see if I can come across it. Any other comments, questions? Let's see if I can just take a few seconds here. There is the book by Birger Gerhardsen called Memory and Manuscript, Oral Tradition and Written Transmission in Rabbinical Judaism in Early Christianity, but I don't think that's exactly what I had in mind when you mentioned that. Anyway, maybe after we're finished, I could come up with it here. All right. Well, if nothing else, certainly nice being with you all, and it's a privilege to be with you, and continued blessings on your operation. And this is a wonderful group. So I hope tonight has been insightful, and appreciate very much what you all do.